Hi everyone. We're going to start out with chapter 17 for this class, and chapter 17 is covering the endocrine system. So for this very first section, we're just going to introduce the endocrine system. We're going to kind of talk about general features, we're going to talk about general functions, and then we're going to go through and compare and contrast the endocrine system with the nervous system. So first off, what is the endocrine system? So the endocrine system is composed of ductless glands, and what these glands do is they actually are going to make and secrete various hormones. And those hormones are going to be released into the bloodstream, and then what the bloodstream does is it transports them throughout the body so they can get to these things called target cells. So let's back up and take a look at some of these definitions before we go on. So first of all, glands. So you guys should be familiar with glands because you talked about glands in 2401. But the glands that you guys talked about in 2401 were exocrine glands. Let me see if I can write that down. Maybe. Exocrine. There we go. Basically what a gland is going to be an organ or a composition of cells that are going to secrete a substance. Exocrine glands, if you remember, were going to be these glands that had ducts, and the glands were going to, the different cells were going to make substances like milk, or they made sebum, or they made sweat, things like that, and those substances traveled through the ducts to get to where they needed to go, which was basically an epithelial surface. So that's going to be different than these endocrine glands. So an endocrine gland is still going to be, again, a gland is going to secrete various substances. But in this case with endocrine, it's going to secrete a hormone. And there are no ducts. What happens is that the hormone has to diffuse through tissue and get to the bloodstream. It doesn't have to go very far. It gets to the bloodstream. So those are going to be some of the main differences between exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So let's take a look at this thing called a hormone right here. I know that you guys know and are familiar with the term hormone, but exactly what is a hormone? The book gives a much longer definition of a hormone, but basically what a hormone is, it's a chemical messenger or a chemical substance that is going to travel through the bloodstream, and it is going to initiate some type of metabolic activity in a cell. So that's a kind of a short definition. Probably not as short as anyone wants it to be, but that's what a hormone is. And we're going to be taking a look at hormones, the different hormones, and exactly what type of activities they are going to cause the cell to do later on. Now let's take a look at this term called target cells. Target cells are going to be these different cells that have a very specific receptor that the hormone can bind to. Take a look at this target cell right here. This is just one single cell. Usually what you have is like a group of cells. You have tissues. We're taking a look at this one cell. Look, it has 3 different receptors. It has this receptor that's shaped kind of like a U. It has this receptor that's shaped kind of like a field goal. And then here's this receptor that's shaped more like a V. That means that it can go in and bind 3 different hormones. Not all cells are like this. Some cells might have 1 receptor. Some cells might have more than 3 receptors. It just depends on the cell that it is. But what it is, it's going to, this football, or I guess field goal shape receptor can only bind 1 type of hormone. Let's say it's insulin. It is only going to bind insulin, and that is it. So it's very shape specific, your receptor and hormone complex that you have. Once the hormone binds to a receptor, and we'll talk more later on how these receptors can be a little bit different. Some are actually inside of the cell, and then some of them are going to kind of look like this. Once the hormone binds to the target cell, it is going to initiate some type of metabolic activity. That could be, protein synthesis. It could be mitosis. So many different things. It could activate an enzyme. So really, again, it just depends on what type of hormone it is and what cell it is. So one of the big things that the endocrine system does is it is going to kind of regulate and control a lot of the body's physiological processes. It is a huge controller of homeostasis in the body. And you're thinking, well, that's what I thought the nervous system did. Well, yeah, it does as well. Both of these organ systems actually are going to go and work together to control the physiological systems of the body. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to go in and compare the two. We're going to go in and look and see how they're similar, and then we're going to look and see how they're different. There's a nice little picture that kind of shows you how how they look, the endocrine gland versus the neuron here. So let's first take a look at how they're common. Well, they both release something called ligands. Ligands is just a kind of a fancy term for a chemical substance. And of course the ligands, but the ligands are different, right? For endocrine system, it's hormones. For nervous system, it's neurotransmitters. Those are chemical substances. Both hormones and neurotransmitters have to bind to a receptor on a particular target cell. And then once they bind, they are going to initiate some type of cellular change. So that's how they're common. Let's take a look and see how they are going to be different. So first of all, let's take a look at their signaling mechanism. Well, endocrine system has a chemical signaling mechanism, right? We just talked about how, there it is, a chemical substance is released. So it has a chemical mechanism. It uses chemicals to communicate with different parts of the body, and that chemical is a hormone. And when I say chemicals, it means that it is going to be a type of molecule that's composed of different elements and things like that. The nervous system does that same thing as well, right? And you're thinking, well, I thought we were looking at differences. Well, we are looking at differences. Yeah, they both use chemicals, but remember the nervous system also has that electrical component as well, that you have that action potential that travels down the axon to actually release that chemical that you have. Let's take a look at the type of ligand. We already talked about these. Hormone for the endocrine system, neurotransmitter for the nervous system, so you guys know that. Pathway. The endocrine system we talked about. Pathway, what do I mean by pathway? Well, how does it get to where it needs to go? We talked about it. Endocrine system uses the bloodstream. What about the nervous system? What does it do? Once that neuron secretes the neurotransmitter, where does it have to go to get to its target? Do you guys remember? Let's go back and take a look at the picture. Look at this right here. This is what's happening. Look at this thing right here. What's that called? That is your synaptic cleft. Remember, it doesn't have a long way to go. It just has to go right across the street to the synaptic cleft, or across the synaptic cleft to its target. So speaking of targets, let's talk about the targets of endocrine system and nervous system. When I talk about targets, I mean what type of tissues or organs will have these specific receptors. For endocrine system, it's pretty much any body cell, any cell in the body. So if they have a specific receptor. But again, remember I talked about how so some cells are going to have these specific receptors for a hormone and some are not going to. It just depends on if you're looking at the mammary glands or if you're looking at muscle tissue and things like that. Let's talk about the nervous system. Remember the different tissues that neurons communicated with? It wasn't a whole lot. Neurons could communicate with other neurons. That was one. Neurons communicated with muscles. I mean, that's how we contracted muscles. So it was your skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle tissue, and also glands. That was about it. So we'll talk about how these two, because of the different targets they have, is going to kind of give very different range of effects as well. Let's talk about response time. Once the hormone or neurotransmitter reaches the target cell, how long does it take for that cell to actually respond to its chemical messenger? Endocrine system, it's going to be slower than the nervous system, and I know that it says on here fast, and when I say fast I mean seconds. Compared to the nervous system is a lot faster. It's usually immediate. I mean, you want it to be immediate with the nervous system, right? Hey, I need to contract my arm, so you want it to be pretty immediate. Endocrine system is a little bit slower, so it can be anywhere from seconds to hours. Range of effect, I probably should have talked about this before response time. But range of effect, if you think about the different cells that they communicate with, endocrine system, it's pretty widespread because of the fact that some of these hormones can go in and communicate with so many different body cells, like the growth hormone. Really, most body cells are going to have a receptor for a growth hormone, so that's why it's widespread. Think about the nervous system. It's very localized. It is usually going to go in and communicate right there. So it's going to be localized. Don't know how much easier to put that. Duration of response. This means once that cell is responding, how long does the response last? For the endocrine system, it's usually long-lasting. When I say long-lasting, it can be anywhere from minutes to days to weeks. Depends on the hormone. Some hormones typically can last longer. Some hormones don't last as long. But they are going to last longer than the nervous system. As soon as the stimulus is gone for the nervous system, your response is gone. It's different in the endocrine system. Sometimes whenever the response is gone, the hormones still kind of can hang out and you can still have a response. So it's pretty different. Let's go on and take a look at the general functions of the endocrine system. I'm sure you're thinking, well, we just talked about it. It controls and maintains and regulates body systems. Well, let's take a look at a little bit more specifics on that. One of the big things, and a lot of these we'll actually get into a lot more in the following chapters. Like for this one, we'll get into a lot more because the next chapter, in chapter 18, we talk about blood. So we'll talk about this more, about how hormones are going to help maintain homeostasis of what's floating around in the bloodstream, how much blood volume is actually inside of a blood vessel, cellular concentration, like how many red blood cells are floating around, platelet numbers, so glucose levels, electrolyte levels like calcium, sodium, potassium, water levels, red blood cells, platelets, all of that is going to be maintained by hormones. Hormones also control reproductive activities everywhere from maturation, development, and functions of the different organs of the reproductive system is going to be a huge endocrine system function here, and also expressing sexual behavior. So this is one that we'll talk about. We'll get into the hormones and the specific functions later on and the reproductive system. We'll introduce the hormones, of course, here in this chapter, but we'll get into a lot more specifics later on. Hormones also help regulate development, growth, metabolism. If you think about growth, I mean, growth hormone is going to go in and help regulate growth of different structures. There's going to be hormones that help make sure that the embryo is going to divide and differentiate correctly. Thyroid hormones are going to help regulate cellular metabolism. So that's going to be a few things. We'll talk a little bit more extensively and in depth about thyroid hormones and growth hormones in this chapter because we don't get to them a whole lot in any other chapter. But we will talk a little bit more about embryo, cell division, and differentiation later on in the very last chapter. And then last but not least, let's talk about how it will go in and control digestive processes as well. This is another one. We're going to talk about the digestive system later on in the digestive system chapter. So we're just going to introduce it now. But as soon as we eat, we have to make sure that the substances that are secreted to help digest our food is carefully controlled. We also have to make sure that how the food moves or the substances move throughout the digestive tract is carefully controlled. We have to make sure that when bile is secreted is carefully controlled. So we'll talk a lot more about that later on. We'll introduce the hormones here, but we'll talk about it later on. So in the next section, we're going to take a look more at the endocrine glands of the endocrine system. So until next time.